a prestigious racing event where the who's who of horse racing gathered to showcase their prize stallions. The paddock gleamed with million-dollar horses, their coats shining under the warm sun, their owners chatting confidently about bloodlines and breeding. Among them stood Robert Jenkins, a wealthy businessman who'd spent a fortune building his racing empire. His prize stallion, Thunderstrike, was the talk of the town, a magnificent beast with championship bloodlines and a price tag that could buy a mansion. But at the far end of the stables was another story altogether. Old Man Wilson stood quietly beside his horse, a small, unassuming brown mare he'd bought for just $50 at a local farm auction. Some folks laughed when they saw him enter, whispering about the country bumpkin, who thought he could compete with the big boys. Wilson had worked the same piece of land for 40 years, his calloused hands and weathered face telling the story of a life spent under the open sky, struggling to make ends meet. "That old nag doesn't belong here," someone muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Wilson just smiled and patted his horse gently. "Don't you listen to them, Penny," he whispered. "We know what you can do." When the race officials saw Wilson's entry form, they'd exchanged skeptical glances. The auction specialists who valued the competing horses nearly fell over when they appraised Wilson's mare at barely $300. Jenkins the millionaire didn't even bother to look Wilson's way. Why would he? Thunderstrike had cost over $2 million and had the finest trainers money could buy. As the horses lined up at the starting gates, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Thunderstrike stood tall and powerful, his muscles rippling beneath his gleaming coat. Next to him, Wilson's horse looked like a child's pony, smaller with no fancy equipment, just a simple saddle and bridle that had seen better days. The crowd fell silent as the gates opened. Thunderstrike burst forward with explosive power, quickly taking the lead as expected. Jenkins smiled smugly from the stands, already planning his victory speech. But something unexpected was happening at the back of the pack. Wilson's little mare was moving with surprising speed, her stride efficient and powerful. At the halfway mark, gasps rippled through the crowd as the impossible seemed to be happening. The $50 horse was gaining ground, passing one expensive thoroughbred after another. Jenkins's smile faded as he grabbed his binoculars in disbelief. No one could believe what they were seeing as the horses rounded the final turn. The auction experts who had dismissed Wilson's horse stood with mouths agape. The commentator's voice rose to a fever pitch as the little mare closed in on Thunderstrike. And then, as they approached the finish line, something happened that would become the stuff of racing legend. Wilson's little mare, Penny, stretched her neck forward and somehow, impossibly, pulled even with Thunderstrike. The crowd erupted, half in disbelief, half in wild excitement at witnessing what could be the greatest upset in racing history. But just as it seemed Penny might actually win, the video freezes on that heart-stopping moment, leaving us all wondering what happened next. To understand the magnitude of this potential upset, we need to go back 6 months earlier. Wilson hadn't always been a poor farmer. Once upon a time, his family owned considerable land and a respectable horse breeding business, but a combination of bad weather, mounting debts, and a serious illness had stripped him of almost everything. His neighbors had watched sadly as he sold off parcel after parcel of his family's heritage, until all that remained was a modest house and 20 acres, barely enough to sustain him. The day Wilson found Penny was one of his lowest. He'd gone to a small local auction hoping to find some affordable farm equipment. Most folks there knew of his situation and gave him sympathetic nods as he walked through the crowd. It was at the very end of the day, when most bidders had gone home, that they brought out a sickly-looking mare that nobody wanted. Starting bid at $100, the auctioneer called half-heartedly. Silence followed. "All right, $75? Still nothing. $50? Anyone? Or we'll have to send her to the glue factory, I'm afraid." Something in Wilson's heart couldn't bear the thought. He raised his hand, spent his last bit of cash, and took the mare home, much to the amusement of onlookers. "Lost your mind, old man," his neighbor had commented. "That horse ain't good for nothing." But Wilson saw something in Penny's eyes, a fighting spirit beneath the neglect. He nursed her back to health, sharing what little food he had, talking to her for hours as he brushed her coat until it began to shine. On early mornings, before the heat of the day, he'd take her for runs across his remaining land, and discovered something remarkable. Penny was fast. Not just quick, but blazingly, impossibly fast. Meanwhile, across the county, Jenkins was building his racing empire. New to the area but flush with tech money, he'd bought the largest estate and immediately set about making himself known in racing circles. His purchase of Thunderstrike for a record amount, made headlines in industry papers, and his boasts about the horse's capabilities were becoming legendary. Jenkins wasn't just building a stable. He was buying prestige, respect, and most importantly to him, admiration. What Jenkins couldn't understand was why the locals seemed so resistant to his charm. He donated to local causes, thrown lavish parties, yet still felt like an outsider. What he didn't realize was that his dismissive attitude toward the simple country folk, as he called them, hadn't gone unnoticed. The regional race was Jenkins' idea, a chance to showcase Thunderstrike before taking him to bigger competitions. He'd personally invited journalists and racing scouts to attend. This was to be his crowning moment. When Wilson submitted his entry form just days before the race, the organizing committee almost rejected it outright. A no-name farmer with an unregistered horse. But something about the rules required they accept all entries that met the basic criteria. As Thunderstrike and Penny thundered down the final stretch neck and neck, the race became more than just a contest of speed. It was old versus new, humility versus arrogance, passion versus money. And just as Penny edged slightly ahead, something strange happened near the railing. A shadowy figure moved quickly, and suddenly Wilson's face transformed from hopeful joy to horror. He started running toward the track, shouting words that were drowned by the roaring crowd as the horses approached the finish line. Wilson's desperate shout pierced through the crowd's roar. "Watch out!" The shadowy figure slipped something through the railing, something that glinted in the sun, right in Penny's path. Time seemed to slow as Wilson watched helplessly from too far away. In that split second, Penny somehow sensed the danger and, in a display of extraordinary athleticism, leaped sideways while maintaining her forward momentum. The object, a bottle with shattered glass, missed her hooves by inches. This happened so quickly that most spectators missed it, their eyes fixed on the finish line where Penny and Thunderstrike were now perfectly matched stride for stride. The race officials, however, had caught the movement on camera. Behind the scenes, security personnel rushed toward the area where the figure had been spotted, but whoever it was had disappeared into the crowd. Back in the stands, Jenkins was leaning forward, gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. His racing manager, Davis, stood beside him with a troubled expression. "She shouldn't be this fast," Davis muttered. "A farm horse with no breeding papers. Impossible." Jenkins shot him a sideways glance. "Fix this," he hissed through clenched teeth, "or don't bother showing up for work tomorrow." What Jenkins didn't know was that one of the journalists he'd invited had a telephoto lens trained not on the horses, but on him. The expression of pure rage on his face, so at odds with the sportsmanship he publicly espoused, would become its own story in the days to come. Meanwhile, Wilson's journey to this moment had been complicated by more than just financial hardship. 3 weeks before the race, his only farmhand, young Joey, had discovered something unusual while cleaning out the barn. Hidden beneath old floorboards was a small metal box containing yellowed racing certificates and a diary. The documents revealed that Penny wasn't just any horse. She was the granddaughter of Lightning Flash, a legendary racer from the 1980s who had mysteriously disappeared before a championship race. The diary belonged to Wilson's late father, detailing how Lightning Flash had been stolen by gamblers who feared the horse would ruin their betting scheme. The horse had apparently escaped, lived as a wild mare for years, and eventually bred with local farm horses. Through some miracle of genetics, Penny had inherited her grandmother's exceptional speed. Joy had urged Wilson to tell everyone about Penny's lineage, to claim the recognition and perhaps financial rewards that might come with it. But Wilson had refused. "Racing isn't about papers and pedigrees," he'd said. "It's about heart. Let her prove herself first." Now, as the horses thundered toward the finish line, that decision weighed heavily on him. Would anyone believe Penny's heritage without documentation? And more troublingly, who would want to hurt his horse? In the crowd, a woman watched the race with particular intensity. She wasn't cheering or gasping like the others. Instead, she studied every movement with calculated precision. Betty Thompson had been the veterinarian who'd certified Thunderstrike's health for his $1 million purchase. She alone knew that Jenkins had pressured her to overlook certain warning signs in the Stallion's health assessment. Signs that indicated Thunderstrike might not have the stamina his bloodline suggested. "If word gets out," Jenkins had threatened, "I'll make sure you never work with valuable horses again." Betty had reluctantly signed the paperwork, but the guilt had eaten at her. Today, watching Thunderstrike labor to keep pace with a supposedly inferior horse, she felt a strange mix of vindication and fear. Jenkins wouldn't take this potential loss well. As the horses approached the final yards, something unexpected happened. Thunderstrike began to falter slightly, his breathing labored. Penny, meanwhile, seemed to find another gear, pulling ahead by a neck. The crowd's roar became deafening. And then, just as victory seemed within reach for the unlikely pair, three things happened simultaneously. A gunshot rang out from somewhere in the distance. Wilson collapsed, clutching his chest, and Jenkins received a text message that made his face turn ashen white. The message simply read, "I know what you did with the real Thunderstrike." Chaos erupted across the racetrack. Security guards sprinted toward the source of the gunshot, while medical personnel rushed to Wilson's side. Despite the pandemonium, the race officials kept their eyes on the finish line where Penny, now seemingly running without guidance, maintained her lead over the struggling Thunderstrike. "Get me out of here," Jenkins hissed to his entourage, his face trained of color as he stared at his phone. His security team formed a protective circle around him, but not before Betty Thompson locked eyes with him across the crowd. The look they exchanged spoke volumes. She knew something was terribly wrong. As paramedics worked on Wilson, young Joey pushed through the crowd and dropped to his knees beside the old farmer. "Hold on, Mr. Wilson," he pleaded, gripping the man's weathered hand. "Penny's about to win. You can't miss this." Wilson's eyes fluttered. "The box," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The proof is in the box." Then his eyes closed as the paramedics lifted him onto a stretcher. Joey felt something pressed into his palm, a small key. Understanding dawned on him immediately. The metal box with Penny's lineage documents wasn't just about proving her heritage. It contained something else, something that had made Wilson a target. Meanwhile, on the track, something remarkable was happening. Penny, despite losing her jockey's guidance, wasn't just maintaining her lead, she was extending it. Racing experts in the crowd watched in astonishment as the $50 mare displayed a running form that hadn't been seen since the legendary days of Lightning Flash. The comparison didn't go unnoticed by an elderly man watching from the sidelines, a former racing commissioner who had personally officiated Lightning Flash's greatest victories. "Good Lord," he murmured, raising his binoculars. "It can't be." In the private viewing box, Jenkins was frantically making phone calls, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Find that photographer," he ordered. "I want every photo from today, every single one." His racing manager, Davis, sat stunned in the corner, finally connecting the dots about what his boss had been hiding. Thunderstrike, the horse Jenkins had paid millions for, wasn't the real Thunderstrike. The true story, which was now threatening to unravel in spectacular fashion, began 2 years earlier when Jenkins had set his sights on purchasing the most promising racehorse in a generation. But days before the sale could be completed, the real Thunderstrike had suffered a career-ending injury. Rather than lose the prestige and business opportunities tied to owning the famous Stallion, Jenkins had conspired with an unscrupulous breeder to substitute another horse, a look-alike with decent but nowhere near exceptional racing genes. The substitution had worked perfectly until today, when faced with a truly gifted runner. The imposter's limitations were becoming painfully apparent, and someone knew the truth. Back on the track, Penny crossed the finish line a full 2 lengths ahead of Thunderstrike, but there was no official celebration yet. The race officials huddled together, reviewing footage of the bottle-throwing incident and discussing whether the disruption warranted special consideration. In the medical tent, Wilson regained consciousness momentarily. "Where's Penny?" were his first words. The paramedic assured him his horse had won, and a ghost of a smile crossed Wilson's face before he was loaded into an ambulance. Joey, clutching the key tightly, slipped away from the crowd and raced toward Wilson's truck. He needed to get to that metal box before anyone else did. As he drove away from the track, he noticed a black SUV pull out behind him. In the rearview mirror, he could see 2 men in dark suits following at a distance. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically on Wilson, whose heart attack turned out to be something else entirely. The attending physician pulled aside a police officer. "This man hasn't had a heart attack," she said quietly. "He's been poisoned." As news of Penny's unofficial victory spread across social media, racing enthusiasts began digging into her background, or lack thereof. Photos of the remarkable mare were being compared to historical images of Lightning Flash, with side-by-side comparisons showing striking similarities. Betty Thompson, gathering her courage, approached the race officials with a file folder containing Thunderstrike's original medical records and evidence of the substitution she'd been pressured to cover up. And at Wilson's small farmhouse, where Joey had just arrived, breathless and frightened, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence as an intruder forced their way in through the back door. Joey clutched the metal box to his chest and looked desperately for an escape route as heavy footsteps moved through the house, coming ever closer to the bedroom where he was hiding. Joey's heart pounded as the footsteps drew closer. He clutched the metal box and pressed himself against the wall, preparing for the worst. The bedroom door swung open, and he found himself face to face with the elderly former racing commissioner. "Son," the old man said gently, "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help. I knew Lightning Flash, and I suspect I knew Wilson's father too." 3 weeks later, the county fairgrounds hosted a crowd 3 times larger than the infamous race day. News vans lined the parking area, and a makeshift stage had been erected near the same finish line where history had been made. At the center of it all stood Penny, her coat gleaming in the sunlight, a blue ribbon attached to her bridle. Wilson, still moving slowly but recovering well from the poison that had nearly taken his life, sat in a chair of honor beside his miraculous mare. The investigation had revealed that one of Jenkins' associates had laced Wilson's water bottle with a fast-acting toxin, hoping to create enough chaos to prevent the race results from being certified. The plan had backfired spectacularly. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Racing Commission chairwoman announced, after thorough DNA testing and verification of the documents recovered from Mr. Wilson's farm, "we can confirm that this remarkable horse, initially purchased for just $50, is indeed the granddaughter of Lightning Flash, one of the greatest racehorses in history." The crowd erupted in cheers as photographers captured the moment. Wilson reached up to stroke Penny's neck, tears in his eyes. Joey stood proudly behind him, no longer just a farmhand, but now a partner in what had become the most talked-about breeding program in the state. As for Jenkins, his empire had crumbled almost overnight. Following Betty Thompson's courageous testimony and the evidence recovered from the metal box, which included photos and breeding certificates proving the Thunderstrike substitution, he faced criminal charges for fraud, attempted murder, and animal endangerment. His associates had quickly turned on him, each providing damning evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. The real Thunderstrike, who had been hidden away on a remote farm after his injury, was now receiving proper care and rehabilitation. Racing authorities were implementing stricter verification protocols, with Betty Thompson leading a new committee on ethical horse breeding and racing practices. "I never raced Penny for the money," Wilson told a reporter after the ceremony. "I did it because she deserved her chance to run. Every creature deserves the chance to show what they're made of, pedigree or not." The story of the $50 horse who outran a millionaire's fake stallion captured hearts worldwide. Offers poured in for Penny, some reaching into the millions, but Wilson declined them all. "Some things aren't for sale," he said simply. Instead, he and Joey established a small foundation to help struggling farmers and rescue neglected horses. They named it Lightning's Legacy, and its first rescue was already showing promising speed on Wilson's track. As the crowd dispersed and the cameras were packed away, Wilson sat alone with Penny in the quiet stables. "Your grandma would be proud," he whispered, feeding her an apple from his pocket. "And my dad would too." Penny nuzzled his hand gently, her intelligent eyes seeming to understand every word. Outside, the sun was setting over the Kentucky hills, pinking the sky in brilliant golds and reds. From humble beginnings had come an extraordinary journey, proving once again that in life, as in racing, it's not about how you start, it's about how you run the race. And sometimes, the most remarkable champions come from the most unlikely places.